Professor Large, you are an expert of China-Africa relations. That's why we are very grateful for the lecture that you have delivered at CERIS today. Now, my question is, do you believe that China's development policy will be much more effective than the policies implemented by the EU or by the former colonial powers during the last 40 years? Is China likely to be more effective by the end of the day than Europe as far as African development is concerned?
Fine. I'll take China's development engagement in Africa as the first question. And I'll begin by noting that this is not the first period in time in which China has provided a development inspiration for African countries and African leaders. Before, communist China provided a model to which Africa could aspire to achieve a socialist modernity in such countries as Tanzania. So this is a debate that's happened before historically in post-colonial Africa. It's not by any means new. What is new, of course, is the nature of the Chinese engagement. And because China has come very far, very fast in Africa, including in its economic role with development implications, there's been much excited talk about the new Chinese model of development amidst debate about the merits of the Washington Consensus or the post-Washington confusion in development thinking versus the so-called Beijing consensus that China is supposedly promoting in Africa. I would argue that it's not promoting anything like a coherent Beijing consensus at all. This is a construct of the West, but its development intervention is significant and increasingly so for African development. In particular, China's changing role in development in Africa today breaks the monopoly of Western dominance over the nature of that development, both the normative principles and the practical modalities. It also offers new opportunities for African actors of different kinds to benefit as well. But I think first and foremost, we must ground this question in the historical production. There is tremendous optimism about the prospects for African development, largely stimulated by the Chinese engagement. There are good reasons to think that the prospects for African development are significantly better today than they were before the Chinese engagement, because China offers an important development alternative to Africa. One of its key roles there is as an emerging development partner that's responsive to African needs and able to not just talk about development, but deliver a range of hard infrastructural benefits, in particular according to African need as well. But the current optimism about the prospects for African development occurs, to my mind, in the context of a number of prior existing and emerging problems which relate to whether or not China can succeed in development where others have failed. First and foremost, we have to contextualize this question within the history of African development, within a thick set of political economy questions and other questions such as conflict or the nature of states, which have stopped or prevented African development from taking place before. China is entering this context as a new development partner, but is being influenced by it at the same time as trying to change it as well. And it's hard to see how the Chinese development, as it's currently formulated, can fundamentally transform these economic and political constraints that Africa has faced. But nonetheless, there are signs of potential in what China is doing. Unlike the West, China operates a policy of formal non-conditionality. It's a heavily economic-focused set of engagement, and it's based upon mutual benefit. So China, for example, through resource-backed loans, it's inherently business partnership. It's not based upon altruism at all. Maybe you could say it's enlightened self-interest. But undoubtedly what China is doing in developmental terms in Africa also benefits its own economic engagement there as well. I think it's important to recognize when we say development in the Chinese context, we're actually talking about a rather different conception of development generally, and also in the context of Africa. The language here doesn't always help conceptually and as an accurate description. Broadly, the Chinese idea of development is much more based upon economic drivers. and much less involves political dynamics, which is why such debates as good governance in Africa are completely outside the Chinese approach to these things, emphasizing as it does non-interference in African internal politics. So whilst China has robust political relationships with African governments, it's reluctant, of course, to engage them in a way of telling them how to do development better. And instead you have the notion that the market can develop, that the economy can develop, and then politics can progress later. This very much replicates China's own domestic development experience, to my mind. But the key point about that, I would suggest, is the lack of a fixed development ideological blueprint in China since 1978, 1979. China's very strengths in developmental terms have been its very flexibility, its response to circumstances, its willingness to go with what works, to experiment from the ground up. And the absence of a one-size-fits-all development approach and this emphasis upon a bottom-up eclecticism of policy options, I think, are the very strengths of China's approach to development, which are quite different from the rigid ideological development agendas that we've seen from such actors as the World Bank or other Western development actors as well. So in a sense, the Chinese model is misleading. It's a non-model. And for African governments to think that there is an example from China that can be followed and implemented in Africa is fundamentally to misconstrue the fact that it's this lack of a template that provided the very strength for China, whose own development success was rationalized post facto as being coherent and planned, but in many ways was much more chaotic and not thought out. China is disturbing the structure of the development industry in Africa. It provides strong competition in terms of ideas, resources, and actions as well in a range of areas. And it's promoting development in a very different way to the established industry. So from the World Bank to NGOs to the UN, a range of international organizations are asking themselves about the secret of China's success, whether or not it could be transferred into Africa. And I think there's a sense of ferment in development circles right now, which is indicative of the end of a monopoly on development debates. And if anyone thought that development was dead, a debate we had not so long ago, it couldn't be further from the truth. Debates about development being reinvigorated. For example, at the end of this year, there'll be a big conference in South Korea, the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, at which the China DAC study group will present its findings. And there's also an International Poverty Reduction Center in China. But I would emphasize the extent to which development as a state-promoted objective is a new area of Chinese foreign relations. And instead, the development phenomenon we're seeing in Africa relate to a range of different corporate and entrepreneurial business interests, as opposed necessarily to deliberate intention. But nonetheless, the bargain China has done with the African continent and its individual states is that China can develop at the same time as Africa can develop. I think there are serious issues there. A predominantly resource extraction-based engagement is seeking to offset that with attempts to stimulate African industrialization. But China is returning to a long-standing problem in African development, which is how can it escape dependency upon natural resources and somehow move up the chain into industry and other forms of business as well. So I think in many ways the debates we're seeing about African development are not new. There are new circumstances, but there are recurring themes which China is the latest in the long line of actors to actually confront. And that's why I think that at the end of the day, as we've seen with previous moments of optimism about development in Africa, or such things as the development decade, this rests upon how African government elites manage the potential, the resources, and the new capability that China is bringing to hard infrastructure, and particularly in Africa. If this new energy, this new potential is to be achievable and sustainable in developmental terms, beyond elites and for more people as well, first and foremost, this depends upon African states harnessing this energy to their own purposes and using it responsibly, which is why we return, I think, to the problem of states, of governance, and the notion of a developmental state more interested in its own population rather than its selfish requirements. And until there is that strategic engagement by African ruling governments of the Chinese development experience, I'm not convinced that this will necessarily convert into a successful long-term development experience, because I think the old problems can recur, and China will be no different in facing them and finding them very difficult to overcome. So I think much remains to be seen about the results of what to date has been really the start of a serious Chinese economic engagement in the continent. And in a sense, we're seeing the emergence of these debates into sharper focus as a result of this deepening engagement, but its implications are far from clear, which is why the need to manage it from the African's perspective is the most important question at the end of the day. And in that, I include not just state governing elites in different parts of Africa, but also other African political actors, including civil society groups, citizen groups, as well as other forms of traditional authority, as well, a whole spectrum of different actors that need to develop a more strategic engagement with the China. Finally, of course, China is one of a number of new development actors in Africa today from the outside. We have to recognize the increasing interest from India, from Brazil, amongst others, and that in some senses it's a new age of external interest in African development. But ultimately, all lessons of development in Africa show that solutions cannot be imposed from outside, which is partly why the Chinese approach of facilitating African development based upon African need is attractive. But at the same time, it's for Africa to decide and manage any kind of sustainable development future.